Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to a number of new members of our Patreon family. Vivian, Sage, Megan, Heather, Ultra Fuchsia, Sue, Soren, St. Judas, Kim, Suzanne, Natalie, and David and Nicole. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener-supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in learning about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive monthly episodes heard nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight we're reading from a new work that I found completely by accident while wandering around Project Gutenberg. Moving Pictures, How They Are Made and Worked by Frederick A. Talbot. Published in 1914 by J.B. Lippincott Company of Philadelphia and William Heinemann of London. And before we get going, let me apologize right now for a nasally voice. I'm still getting over COVID, which is a bit of a drag, but I thought we'd give it a go. Let's begin. Preface. The marvelous universal popularity of moving pictures is my reason for writing this volume. A vast industry has been established, of which the great majority of picture palace patrons have no idea, and the moment appears timely to describe the many branches of the art. I have endeavored to deal with the whole subject in a popular and comprehensive manner. I have been assisted by several friends who have enabled me to throw considerable light upon the early history of motion photography and the many problems that had to be mastered before it met with public appreciation. Messrs. Weiss and Bull, the director and assistant director respectively of the Mary Institute in Paris, Monsieur George Demeny, Messrs. Frank L. Dyer, the president of Thomas A. Edison Incorporated, W. F. Green, Robert W. Paul, James Williamson, Lumiere and Sons, Richard G. Holloman, the Eastman Kodak Company, Dr. J. Commandon, F. Percy Smith, Albert Smith, and the numerous firms engaged in one or other of the various branches of the industry. I am indebted especially to the editor of L'Illustration, the well-known Parisian illustrated weekly newspaper, in conjunction with the Société des Établissements Gaumont, for permission to publish the photographs illustrating chapters 14, 20, and 21, as well as the frontispiece. Also to Mr. A. Hopkins, the author of Magic, and to Messrs. Munn & Co., the proprietors of the Scientific American of New York, USA. The book makes no claim to being a practical manual, because thereby intricate technicalities would have been unavoidable. The information respecting the various mechanical aspects of cinematography are set forth in a readable manner so that the broad principles may be understood. While the most popular features of motion photography are described fully, I have not omitted to introduce the reader to the educational and scientific developments, which are more wonderful and fascinating. Indeed, the cinematograph will probably achieve greater triumphs in these fields than it has accomplished already as a source of amusement. Frederick A. Talbot. Moving Pictures: How They Are Made and Worked. Chapter 1. What is animated photography? From the day when it was found possible by the aid of sunlight to fix a permanent image of an object upon a sensitized surface, inventors steadily applied their ingenuity to the problem of instantaneous photography. In other words, they strove to realize the possibility of photographing an object in motion. In our days, the idea of snapshot photography is such a commonplace that we can no longer realize the proportions of the task which confronted the early inventors. Probably most of us are unacquainted with the conditions under which the first photographs were taken. The writer has often heard a member of his family relate the amusing story of an ordeal which, as a lad, the latter underwent at the hands of the Frenchman Daguerre. He was seized upon by the inventor as an experimental subject, and was forced to sit in the brilliant sunlight for a long time. It seems incredible, but it is true that when photography was in its infancy, an exposure of 6 hours was required to secure a recognizable impression of an object, a circumstance which left practically nothing but still life as feasible subjects for photography. The problem which confronted the pioneers of instantaneous photography was the reduction of the period of exposure from about 20,000 seconds to a mere fraction of a second. Considering the magnitude of this difficulty, it is not surprising that the average person was skeptical as to its solution. The possibility of fixing a horse in the act of jumping, a bird in the act of flying, or an orator's lips at the moment of uttering a word must have seemed nearly as remote as the discovery of the philosopher's stone. It is interesting to imagine the sensations of the skeptic of 100 years ago, to whom instantaneous photography appeared a chimerical ideal, should he be recalled to life today and be shown first a procession passing down the street, and a few hours afterward the same procession repeating itself before his eyes upon a screen in a darkened room, with all the semblance of reality in color and animation. In the end, it was the chemist who solved the problem of instantaneous photography, without which animated photography as we know it today would never have been even conceivable. He carried out innumerable laboratory experiments for the purpose of rendering the sensitized surface more and more susceptible to light, accelerating its actinic speed, as it is called, until at last he revolutionized photography, as he has changed nearly every other field of our modern industrial life. He succeeded in preparing a surface or emulsion so sensitive to light that it can take a picture clear, distinct, and full of detail, not merely in the space of 1 second, but in less than 1,000th part of a second, a picture equal, if not superior, to those which in the early days of photography required an exposure 20 million times as long. The wonderful achievement of instantaneous photography assumed at first a scientific rather than a commercial value. Many a snapshot is taken which does not betray whether the plate has been exposed for 6 hours or only 1,000th of a second. But on the other hand, a snapshot of a quickly moving subject may seize upon and fix an interesting or characteristic motion. It was this fact which led certain ingenious minds to perceive in instantaneous photography a valuable means of analyzing motion. If a single photograph reproduced the exact posture of a moving subject at any given instant of time, they argued that a series of such photographs, if taken in sufficiently rapid succession, would form a complete record of the whole cycle of movements involved. For instance, in the jump of a horse or the flap of a bird's wing. Here again, the inventor encountered a difficulty almost as great as the initial one of instantaneous photography. Not only had the chemist to devise a new sort of sensitized plate, with a gelatin coating better and more convenient to handle than the medium before employed, but the mechanical engineer, the optical instrument maker, and the lens maker had to cooperate on a special sort of camera, which should minimize the interval between successive exposures. As earlier inventors had reduced the duration of the period of exposure, modern ones have succeeded in their turn in reducing the interval between exposures to a minute fraction of a second. When this result was achieved, animated photography became a reality. It was possible to secure a long series of consecutive snapshots or instantaneous pictures depicting motion, recorded at such brief intervals that when they were passed swiftly before the eyes, they produced the illusion of movement. At this point, it is best to consider the physiological basis upon which animated photography rests. The word illusion, as used above, correctly describes what takes place. The eye sees a swift succession of instantaneous photographs, but it is deluded into believing that it sees actual movement. We have all marveled at the magician who causes bottles, eggs, birds, and animals to appear and disappear mysteriously before our very eyes. We know that it is trickery, pure and simple, that the eye is being deceived. The camera is a far more perfect trickster than the most accomplished illusionist that has ever lived, and moving pictures are the most cunning illusion that has ever been devised. In order to convey this delusion, the photographer has taken advantage of one deficiency of the human eye. This wonderful organ of ours has a defect which is known as visual persistence. Briefly defined, this means that the brain persists in seeing an object after it is no longer visible to the eye. I will make this clear by further explanation. The eye is in itself a wonderful camera. The imprint of an object is received upon a nervous membrane, which is called the retina. This is connected with the brain, where the actual conception of the impression is formed by the optic nerve. The picture, therefore, is photographed in the eye and transmitted from that point to the brain. Now, a certain period of time must elapse in the conveyance of this picture from the retina along the optic nerve to the brain, in the same manner that an electric current flowing through a wire or water passing through a pipe must take a certain amount of time to travel from one point to another, although the movement may be so rapid that the time occupied on the journey is reduced to an infinitesimal point and might be considered instantaneous. When the picture reaches the brain, a further length of time is required to bring about its construction, for the brain is something like the photographic plate, and the picture requires developing. In this respect, the brain is somewhat sluggish, for when it has formulated the picture imprinted on the eye, it will retain that picture even after the reality has disappeared from sight. This peculiarity can be tested very easily. Suppose the eye is focused upon a white screen. A picture suddenly appears. The image is reflected upon the retina of the eye and transmitted thence to the brain along the optic nerve. Before the impression reaches the brain, the picture has vanished from the sight of the eye, yet the image still lingers in the brain. The latter persists in seeing what is no longer apparent to the eye, just as plainly and as distinctly as if it were in full view. When the image does disappear, it fades away gradually from the brain. True, the duration of this continued impression in the brain is very brief. In the average person, it approximates about 2/48 of a second, which appears so short as not to be worth consideration. Still, in a fraction of time, a good deal may happen. And in the case of animated photography, it suffices to bring a second picture before the eye, ere the impressions of the preceding image has faded from the brain. The result is that the second picture becomes superimposed in the brain upon the preceding image, and being stronger and more brilliant, it causes the disappearing image to merge or dissolve into itself. Indeed, one might go farther and say that the brain acts in the same manner as a dissolving lantern. This apparatus is very familiar to us all, and in its most approved type, one view is dissolved into another. For the purpose, 2 lanterns are required, placed either side by side or one above the other, and both focused upon the screen. For the purpose of illustrating our complex point, we will consider that they are one above the other. A slide is projected brilliantly from the uppermost lantern. Presently, the moment arrives to change the slide. If the operator withdrew it from the upper lantern and inserted another, there would be a defined break or blank interval upon the screen betraying the change. So he inserts the new slide in the lower lantern, at the same time increasing the volume of light emitted from that lantern and diminishing the volume thrown from the upper lantern. The result is that the picture projected from the upper lantern becomes fainter and fainter, while that shown by the lower lantern becomes stronger and stronger, until only the latter is seen upon the screen. The former has merged or dissolved into the latter. The same action takes place in the brain in connection with cinematography. A picture is thrown upon the screen and remains visible for 1/32nd part of a second, It is then eclipsed by the shutter, and supposing that the photographs are taken at the rate of 16 pictures per second, for the next 1/32nd part of a second, the screen is darkened owing to the passage of the shutter. This division of time is not strictly correct, as we shall see later, but for present purposes I have considered the intervals of exposure and eclipse to be of equal duration. Now, as a picture will linger in the brain for 2/48ths of a second after it has vanished from the sight of the eye, the brain retains the impression during the 1/32nd part of a second, while the shutter is passing across the lens. The second picture now comes before the eye, and although the previous picture still will remain in the brain for another 1/96th part of a second, the difference between 1/32nd and 2/48ths, the new picture, being the more brilliant, becomes superimposed upon that already obtained, and consequently causes the former dying image to merge into the later and brighter impression. This successive dissolution of one picture into the other continues until the whole string of snapshots is exhausted. It will be noticed that every picture remains on the screen for 1/32nd of a second, followed by a period of darkness of nearly equal duration, the pictures thus being projected at the rate of 16 per second. The illusion of movement is enhanced by the fact that all fixed and stationary objects retain their relative positions in each succeeding image. Suppose, for instance, that a series of pictures depicting a man walking along a street are being shown upon a screen. In the first picture, the man is shown with his left foot in the air. This remains in sight for 1/32nd of a second and then disappears suddenly. Though the picture has vanished from the eye, the brain still persists in seeing the left foot slightly raised. 1/32nd part of a second later, the next picture shows the man with his left foot on the ground. The shops, houses, and other stationary objects in the second image occupy the positions shown in the first picture, and consequently the dying impression of these objects is revived, while the brain receives the impression that the man has changed the position of his foot in relation to the stationary objects, and the left foot which was raised melts into the left foot upon the ground. The eye imagines that it sees the left foot descend. Another 1/32nd part of a second passes, and the right foot is seen elevated. But the fixed objects retain their positions still, and so on. The brain only notices the difference in the position of the moving objects, and thus secures an illusory idea that movement is taking place. I have taken a very simple example to illustrate the idea. As a matter of fact, moving pictures of men walking are seldom perfectly successful, generally having a jerky movement. Thus we have seen what we describe as animated photography is not animation at all. All that happens is that a long string of snapshot photographs, taken at intervals of 1/24th or 1/32nd part of a second, are passed at rapid speed before the eye. If the pictures are projected at the rate of 1 per second, they resemble ordinary magic lantern projections. As the operator slowly and gradually increases the speed, the figures shown in the pictures assume a spasmodic motion, as if their limbs were moved jerkily by means of strings, this action becoming less and less pronounced as the speed is accelerated, until at last, when the operator gains the requisite rate of projection, the jerky movement becomes resolved into steady, rhythmic action. In the early days, it was difficult to convey the impression that motion was being shown, because the movement of the shutter cutting off the picture was so emphasized as to convey a distinct sense of blankness between the successive images. This regular intermittent occurrence of invisibility, described as flicker, caused tremendous strain to the eyes and provoked nauseating headache. When the flicker was eliminated, the strain ceased. The illusion was rendered more perfect as well. In order to satisfy oneself that the semblance of animation is an illusion, one has only to compare the projection of a moving object upon the screen and its appearance in the camera obscura. In the latter case, absolute continuous motion is shown. It may be said that complete animation by photography is quite out of the question with the single camera and projector. How it can be avoided and a more perfect camera obscura effect produced upon the screen is described later. Mechanical ingenuity has not succeeded yet in achieving such a result by means of a single lens. As a matter of fact, only 1/2 or less of the movement that actually takes place is recorded upon the film. What is lost occurs during the period the shutter is closed after exposure, in order to permit a fresh area of sensitized surface to be brought into position behind the lens. However, the lapses are equal in point of time, and when 16 pictures are taken per second, the interruption in the movement is not detected by the brain. It may be asked why the operator confines himself to photographing at a speed of about 16 pictures per second. This question is governed for the most part by economical motives. Film is expensive, and therefore the obvious point is to consume the minimum of material to secure the illusion. When Edison produced the kinetoscope, at least 30 pictures per second were necessary to bring about the illusion, but Messrs. Lumiere and Paul, by means of their apparatuses, which were the first commercial cinematographs, reduced the number to 16 pictures per second. If 24 photographs were taken and projected per second, the result would be practically no better than when only 16 pictures were made in the same period, so that the additional 8 pictures and their requisite length of film represent so much wasted effort and material. This law in regard to visual persistence concerning the number of pictures per second holds good only so long as pictures are taken and projected in monochrome or black and white. When animation in color is introduced, the illusory effect produced upon the brain becomes disturbed, as is explained in the chapter dealing with this latter development of the art. An interesting illustration of the fact that the eye is deceived may be narrated. A film of a train passing through a tunnel was required. 2 trains were secured for the purpose, and at the rear of the leading train, the camera was mounted in order to photograph the one following, care being observed to keep them at equal distance apart. In the darkness of the tunnel, the question of illumination for the purposes of the exposures was somewhat perplexing. Various expedients were attempted, but all to no avail, and it appeared as if the task would have to be abandoned. One of the party thereupon suggested a novel solution of the difficulty. A section of the track was marked off and subdivided into short sections. The train was brought to the first mark and there stopped, when a flashlight photograph was made. It was then advanced to the next mark, and another flashlight instantaneous picture was secured. This process was repeated several times, the train being moved forward about 18 inches between each exposure. About 50 exposures were made in this manner, and the length of exposed film thus obtained was multiplied to form a continuous picture of great length. When projected on the screen, several hundred photographs were passed before the audience at the speed of 16 pictures per second, and the semblance of motion was perfect, the train having the appearance of traveling through the tunnel at express speed. This is one of the most interesting examples known to me of illusion by animated photography, and although it was not motion at all that was recorded, still it sufficed to convey the impression of movement to the public. In the course of the following chapters, however, various successful illusions caused by this means are described, especially in regard to trick pictures. Chapter 2: The First Attempts to Produce Moving Pictures. The idea of producing apparent animation by means of pictures is by no means new. The origin of the most primitive form of moving picture device is lost in the mist of antiquity, but it is certain that long before photography was conceived, animated pictures were in vogue and constituted a source of infinite amusement among children. The illusion was secured by a simple device known as the zoetrope or wheel of life. It consists of a small cylinder mounted on a vertical spindle in such a way that it is free to revolve horizontally. A band of thin cardboard or thick paper on which is painted a series of pictures, generally in color, such as a horse jumping, a child swinging, or two youngsters playing seesaw, is placed horizontally around the inside of the lower half of the cylinder. The upper half is pierced at regular intervals by long, narrow slits or vertical openings, which come opposite the pictures and extend only about halfway down the length of the wall. When the cylinder is rotated sharply and one looks through the slits, the pictures portray apparent motion. The horse rises and falls in the jump, the swing moves to and fro, and the seesaw goes up and down, in accordance with the laws of visual persistence. Each successive picture, it must be pointed out, is interrupted by the space in the surface of the wall between two consecutive slits through which one peeps into the cylinder. We have, in fact, a cinematograph in the most primitive form, the space between the apertures corresponding to the opaque sector of the shutter of the camera and of the projector, whereby one picture is eclipsed from view on the screen to permit the next to be brought before the lens. Indeed, one can easily convert the zoetrope into a cinematograph if instead of painted pictures, prints of a cinematograph film are mounted in the same way. As a matter of fact, some ingenious person followed this practice years ago, thus unconsciously producing the first animated pictures by photography, and in a crude way anticipating the kinetoscope. From time to time, the zoetrope was modified and revived in the praxinoscope, phenakistoscope, zoopraxinoscope, and a number of other forms with awe-inspiring names. In every instance, however, it was merely our old friend in a new guise. One of these modifications created a flutter of excitement in France in 1877. It was called the praxinoscope, and its creator, Monsieur Reynaud, for the first time enabled a large audience to see animation upon the screen. In this case, projection was carried out in a highly novel manner. The front or proscenium opening of the stage was occupied by a large white screen, such as is used for magic lantern projection, the operator and his apparatus being on the stage behind out of sight. Accordingly, the audience saw the picture through the sheet. At the back of the stage, a limelight lantern was set up, from which a still life picture was thrown, filling the greater part of the surface of the screen. The picture thus shown formed, as it were, the setting for the animated picture, in just the same way as the scenery comprises the environment for a stage play. Below the level of the stage was a large rectangular table, at each corner of which were placed small vertical rollers. At one end of the table were two large spools, fitted with handles which were revolved horizontally. One spool carried a long band of transparent material, on which were painted at regular intervals silhouette figures in color in successive stages of movement. The band led from this spool round the vertical roller immediately adjacent, then along the side of the table to the next corner, on to the next corner, on to the third corner, back to the fourth corner, and then to the empty reel on which it was wound. By simultaneously rotating the loaded spool with the left hand and the second reel with the right hand, the transparent picture band was passed round the table from one spool to the other. Centrally with the sheet, and on a level with the table, there was a second limelight lantern, the back of which was towards the audience. This lantern threw its rays upward at an angle of 45 degrees or so. As the band of pictures traveled along the table edge, from the first to the second corner roller, it was passed through this second lantern, which projected the silhouette picture into a mirror hung overhead at the back of the stage, which in turn reflected the image on the screen. The figures on the band thrown from the second lantern appeared in the scene of the slide shown by the first lantern. As the band was moved forward, bringing successive phases of action upon the screen, apparent motion was produced. In fact, animated pictures were shown, and it was possible with a number of spools of painted bands to produce a comedy, tragedy, or other stage play in pictures. This crude apparatus was the first attempt to portray moving pictures upon a sheet before a large audience. As instantaneous photography developed, and efforts were made to adapt photographic records instead of painted pictures to the praxinoscope, great difficulty was experienced in securing the consecutive pictures sufficiently close to one another so as to reduce the loss of action between two successive pictures to the minimum. The cameras available were not suited to this work. Too much time was lost in removing the exposed sensitized surface to permit another unexposed area to be brought before the lens. About 1872, Mr. Muybridge, an ingenious Englishman resident in San Francisco, conceived a novel means of obtaining snapshot photographs in rapid succession. He maintained that such photographs taken at regular intervals, reproduced in such a manner as to simulate natural animation, would reveal the peculiar attitudes of animals in motion and would prove of invaluable service to artists. He approached Governor Stanford and unfolded his scheme. Stanford was so impressed that he placed every facility at Muybridge's disposal for the completion of his experiment, including the use of his valuable stud of horses and exercising track. As it was impossible to secure the desired end with a single camera, Muybridge built a studio beside the track, in which 24 cameras were placed side by side in a row. On the opposite side of the track facing the studio, he erected a high fence painted white, while across the track between the studio and the screen, 24 threads were stretched, each of which was connected with a powerful spring, which held in position the shutter of a camera. When all this was ready, a horse was driven over this length of track at a canter, gallop, trot, or walk as desired, and as the animal passed each camera, it broke the thread controlling its shutter, so that the horse photographed itself in its progress. In these experiments, however, Muybridge made no effort to secure detail. The photographs were taken in brilliant sunlight, and the white screen threw a dazzling reflection, causing the objects to stand out in bold relief so that the record appeared in silhouette. As these photographs were taken for a specific purpose, the analysis of movement, the screen was subdivided into panels, whereby it was possible to determine the distance between each successive picture. As Muybridge's experiments were carried out upon a somewhat private basis, the information about them that reached Europe was of a very meager description. In France, however, they aroused a strong curiosity and peculiar interest, especially in artistic and scientific circles. They appealed especially to one man, Meissonier. The great artist, whose accuracy in the most minute detail was proverbial, was fascinated. He had observed very closely the curious attitudes that horses assume when in rapid motion, and had committed the observations to his canvases, only to meet with strenuous hostile criticism from his colleagues and the public. So when Governor Stanford, while visiting Paris, displayed some of Muybridge's photographs, the great painter spent hours in studying them and characterized them as an incalculable aid to art. Through Governor Stanford, he extended an invitation to Muybridge. In the following year, the Anglo-American experimenter, who might be described as the father of animated photography, visited the French capital and received a warm greeting by Meissonier. The artist had been criticized for his views concerning muscular action as displayed by the animals on his canvases. Yet here was a man who could demonstrate, by the conclusive evidence of photography, that his views were correct. Meissonier arranged a private demonstration, which ranked as one of the most important social events of the year in Paris. Among those who accepted the invitation to witness the new wonder were Jerome, Goupil, Steinhall, Détaillé, Alexander Dumas, and Dr. Malaise. Muybridge had brought a representative collection of photographs with him, showing horses in movement, dogs, deer, and other animals running and jumping, as well as men wrestling, leaping, and performing other athletic exercises. The pictures were examined at great length individually. Then, by means of the zoopraxiscope, a form of the wheel of life, whereby pictures in action could be thrown upon the screen, they were displayed in animation, thereby conclusively demonstrating the fact that what appeared so incredibly singular an attitude in a painting or an individual photograph was in reality part of a graceful, harmonious natural movement. There was one feature of Muybridge's work which must not be overlooked, and which decidedly restricted its application. A battery of cameras had to be employed, placed side by side. It was as if a number of photographers, standing in a row, pressed a button the instant the object in motion was opposite their respective cameras. All the photographs were broadside views and taken from the same relative position. The results were not as the following eye of one person saw them, but as the eyes of 20 or 30 persons, standing side by side, grasped a glimpse of motion during the 5,000th part of a second. If Muybridge had attempted to take 900 photographic impressions, such as the cinematograph camera records in the space of a minute today, he would have required 900 cameras for the purpose. Of course, such a plan had no commercial possibilities. Its real value lay in the fact that it stimulated the ingenuity of a host of inventive brains towards the solution of animated photography. One and all were bent upon securing the same result that Muybridge had achieved, but with a single camera and from one point of view. Among these experimenters, the names of Green and Evans, Akers and Paul stand preeminent in Great Britain, while France and the United States had an equal number of contemporaneous investigators engaged upon the problem. Even Muybridge himself attempted its solution, for he realized only too well that a battery of cameras was impracticable to ensure the commercial success of animated photography. And with that, I think we'll end this evening's reading from Moving Pictures, How They Are Made and Worked by Frederick A. Talbot. Frankly, I found that fascinating, and I look forward to learning more about the history of something we so take for granted today. I hope you enjoyed it as well. If you'd like to read this work for yourself and see the photographs and illustrations contained in it, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect or suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, the best place to catch me is on Twitter at BoringBooksPod, or drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.